The confirmation did not arrive with thunder. It arrived in a sealed folder, placed quietly on a polished table, while Camilla watched the faces around her change before a single word was spoken. The trustees had reached their decision, and the meaning was unmistakable. A cherished royal estate had not been reserved for the Queen Consort, nor for Charles, but quietly promised to Princess Charlotte. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla did not move. She did not reach for the folder. She simply stared at it, as though the paper itself had betrayed her, while Charles sat beside her with his eyes lowered and his jaw held tight. William remained across the table, calm but guarded, and Catherine stayed near him, silent in the way people become silent when they already know the wound is deeper than anyone can admit. The trustees, the appointed guardians responsible for protecting royal property and family provisions, had not come to suggest. They had come to confirm. A royal estate, meaning a privately held property tied to the family's legacy rather than ordinary government business, had been quietly reserved for Charlotte through a protected family provision, a legal promise designed to survive pressure, grief, and changing palace moods. That was why this moment mattered. It was not just a question of who would one day hold keys to a house. It was a question of who the monarchy believed should carry a piece of its future. Charles felt the room closing around him. He understood Camilla's pain because the estate had become, in her mind, proof that she belonged fully and finally inside the royal story. Yet he also understood the power of Charlotte's name in that folder, because his granddaughter was not being handed a reward. She was being shielded by a promise older than the argument now unfolding. The king glanced toward William, and the prince's expression gave nothing away. That silence unsettled Camilla more than anger would have. She saw no surprise in him, no confusion, only a careful stillness that suggested he had been preparing for this moment long before she had known it was coming. Catherine sensed the shift before anyone spoke again. She placed her hand near William's arm, not enough to interrupt him, but enough to steady him, and Camilla noticed. That small gesture changed the air. It made the decision feel less like a document and more like a family line being drawn in front of her. The trustees explained that the promise had been preserved for years, known only to a narrow circle, protected because Charlotte's future place could not be left vulnerable to adult rivalry. Camilla's face tightened. Charles said nothing. William still waited. Catherine still watched. And as Camilla absorbed the blow, the palace had to confront a colder truth. Every person in that room had something different to lose. At the heart of the decision stood Princess Charlotte, too young to command a room, yet suddenly powerful enough to change the emotional balance of the monarchy. Around her name gathered adults with history, pride, fear, and unfinished grief. Camilla saw exclusion. Charles saw conflict. William saw duty. Catherine saw a daughter pulled into a legacy she had never asked to carry. Camilla understood the cruelty of it before anyone explained the finer details. The estate was not only land to her, it was acceptance made solid, a place that could have told the world she was not merely tolerated, not merely placed beside Charles, but written into the royal future with the weight of permanence. For years, the Queen Consort had fought for that silent recognition, and now a child's name had appeared where she believed her own standing should have been protected. Charlotte had no ambition in this. She had not demanded anything, yet her innocence made the wound sharper, because Camilla could not direct her pain at the little girl without exposing how lonely that pain truly was. Charles felt two loyalties press against him until neither one felt survivable. He was the husband sitting beside Camilla, aware of every breath she was holding back. He was also the grandfather, hearing Charlotte's future spoken about as though it were already a battlefield. The king folded his hands in front of him, trying to hide the unease running through him, but William saw it. Catherine saw it too. And the silence between them grew heavier, because everyone understood why this mattered. If Charles defended Camilla too fiercely, he risked appearing to weaken a promise made for Charlotte. If he protected the provision without hesitation, he left his wife feeling abandoned in the very room where she needed him most. William chose his words like a man walking across glass. He knew that any defense of Charlotte could sound like a rejection of Camilla, and any comfort offered to the Queen Consort could be twisted into surrender. Catherine remained controlled, but inside, she understood the darker cost. The promise did not simply secure Charlotte's inheritance. It placed the young princess beneath a spotlight she had never asked to stand under. A trustee finally broke the tension, explaining that the estate had never been meant as a prize for power, but as continuity, a bridge to a younger generation untouched by old rivalries, old wounds, and old resentments. Camilla listened, but the explanation did not heal her. It sharpened the mystery. Her eyes moved from Charles to William, then toward the trustee who had spoken with such careful certainty. The pain in her face changed into something colder, more focused. Her voice dropped, quiet enough to make the room listen harder. Who approved this? And with that single question, shock turned into investigation. But the answer to Camilla's question did not begin in that room. It began with one private moment years earlier that changed everything. Every royal rupture has a beginning, but this one began with a gesture so small that only a few understood its meaning. It happened at a private family ceremony, when Charlotte stood beside Catherine, and an older promise was quietly revived. By the time Camilla noticed the shift, the decision had already begun moving through the silent machinery of royal inheritance. Catherine remembered that day with a weight she could never fully explain. Charlotte had stood beside her at Windsor during a private family ceremony, marking the young princess's first formal appearance at an estate dedication, and what should have been a quiet family milestone became something far heavier. The late monarch watched the child closely, not with cold judgment, but with the kind of attention that made everyone nearby understand she had seen something important. Charlotte had been nervous. She had tried to stand properly, speak carefully, and carry herself with the composure expected from a girl born so close to the center of history. Later, she asked Catherine whether she had done it properly, and that simple question stayed with her mother like a bruise. It made the inheritance feel less like privilege and more like a burden being placed on small shoulders. William carried the same memory differently. To him, that ceremony was the first time he realized Charlotte was no longer being seen only as his daughter. She was being measured by history, watched by advisors, and quietly positioned inside a future she was still too young to understand. The prince had noticed the late monarch's reaction, the gentle pause, the careful look, the way one brief moment seemed to settle into royal memory. That was why the estate dedication mattered. An estate dedication is a formal family act connecting a property to duty, legacy, or future use, and in this case, it became the emotional spark behind everything that followed. It gave the trustees a reason to believe Charlotte was not being rewarded. She was being protected. Camilla had never been told how much weight that day carried. She had heard whispers of provisions and family protections, but not the full truth. After the ceremony, a private memorandum was created, a written instruction preserved for trusted eyes only, stating that the estate should remain tied to Charlotte's future role rather than being absorbed into wider household claims. A memorandum, in plain terms, is an official note that records a decision so it cannot easily be forgotten or denied later. That paper became the hidden bridge between a child's nervous question and a queen consort's devastation years later. Camilla felt the omission more deeply than the decision itself. If the estate had been promised, why had she been left outside the knowledge of it? If the late monarch had seen Charlotte as the future, what did that say about her own place in the present? The queen consort stopped looking at the folder as the enemy, and started looking at the faces around her. William knew more than he had said. Catherine remembered more than she had offered. Charles had carried silence like a crown of thorns. That silence could not survive the next meeting. Because Camilla no longer wanted explanations. She wanted someone to answer her face to face. The confrontation was not loud at first. That made it worse. Camilla entered the private room with Charles beside her, but her eyes went straight to William. There were no aides, no press notes, no careful palace phrases to soften the blow. Only a closed door, a table between them, and the name of Princess Charlotte hanging over every breath. Camilla sat down slowly, but nothing about her felt settled. She had requested this meeting after learning that the estate promise did not begin with a sudden trustee vote, but with a protected family arrangement that had been moving quietly beneath palace life for years. A protected family arrangement means a private royal instruction, designed to keep a promise safe from pressure, rivalry, or later attempts to rewrite it. That detail mattered because it made the decision harder to challenge. It was not an emotional favor. It was not a passing preference. It had been built to endure. The Queen Consort looked at William as though he was the only person in the room who could explain why she had been left outside something so important. Charles remained beside her, but the king did not command the space. He looked like a husband trapped between pain and duty, a father watching his son brace for impact, and a grandfather hearing Charlotte's name become the center of a family fracture. William knew the question before Camilla asked it. Still, when it came, it landed like a blade. She asked whether he had known before the trustees confirmed the promise, and the prince paused. That pause changed everything. It was not long, but it was enough. Camilla saw the truth inside it before he spoke, and the silence hurt her more than a direct confession could have. William answered carefully. He admitted he knew the estate had been discussed, but he denied creating the promise, shaping it against her, or using Charlotte as a weapon. His voice stayed controlled, yet the strain beneath it was impossible to miss. He was protecting his daughter, but he also knew that every word in Charlotte's defense could sound like another door closing against Camilla. Catherine stepped in before the wound widened beyond repair. She spoke gently, but there was steel beneath her calm. Charlotte must not be punished, she said, for decisions made by adults long before the young princess understood the weight of her own name. Catherine's words mattered, because they shifted the room from accusation to consequence. This was no longer only about Camilla's loss. It was about whether a child would be turned into the face of a fight she never chose. Charles reached for the review request, the document that could have opened a challenge to the trustees' decision, and everyone watched his hand. Then the monarch set his pen down without signing. Camilla understood the signal instantly. Charles had not shouted. He had not rejected her with cruel words. But by refusing to overturn the confirmation, he had chosen the promise over her demand. The Queen Consort rose slowly from her chair, her face pale with the shock of recognition. She had entered the room hoping to recover influence. Instead, she discovered its limits, and once Charles refused to undo the decision, the true power behind the promise stepped out from behind the curtain. Power in the monarchy does not always wear a crown. Sometimes it sits in legal clauses, sealed minutes, trustee votes, and the cold discipline of people trained never to tremble. Camilla had expected emotion to move the room. Instead, she encountered something harder, a decision protected by duty, memory, and documents no one could bend without breaking the monarchy's own rules. Camilla had faced criticism before, but this felt different. Criticism could be endured. Silence could be managed. Public storms could be waited out. But the trustees were not moved by sympathy, and that made their authority feel colder than any headline ever could. They held legal and ceremonial responsibility over the estate provision, meaning they were the appointed guardians of the promise and the rules surrounding it. That mattered because their confirmation carried more force than a palace preference, more weight than a private request, and more permanence than Camilla had expected. The Queen Consort looked from one face to another, searching for hesitation. She found none. Their role was guardianship, not rebellion. They were not trying to insult her. They were enforcing something built to survive exactly this kind of pain. Charles felt humiliation rise slowly, like heat beneath the skin. The trustees were not openly defying him, and somehow that made it worse. No one raised a voice against the king. No one challenged his crown. Yet every careful phrase proved the same brutal point. Even he could not simply erase the promise made around Charlotte. He had spent a lifetime inside the machinery of monarchy, but now that machinery was turning in a direction he could not control. Camilla noticed his silence, and it wounded her almost as much as the ruling itself. She had hoped his presence would bend the room toward her. Instead, his stillness confirmed that the line had already been drawn. One senior trustee explained the provision with painful calm. He described protective language written into the estate record, wording designed to prevent temporary household influence from redirecting the inheritance away from Charlotte. Temporary household influence meant pressure from any current royal circle that might try to change a long-term promise for short-term emotional or political reasons. That explanation mattered because it made Camilla understand the true depth of her exclusion. The clause had not been added by accident. It had been placed there like a locked gate, guarding Charlotte's future from an adult battle that everyone now pretended had come as a surprise. William understood the clause before the trustee finished speaking. The prince heard in it the shape of the very confrontation he had just survived. Camilla wounded, Charles torn, Catherine protective, and Charlotte caught at the center, without ever choosing to stand there. His face remained controlled, but inside, he knew the promise had been written to protect his daughter from this exact storm. Camilla asked for reconsideration one final time, quieter now, almost drained. The answer did not change. The trustees refused, and with that refusal, the decision escaped the private chamber and began reshaping palace life immediately. The paperwork had spoken, but the first real damage appeared not in legal language. It appeared in the way people began treating Camilla afterward. Fallout rarely begins with a public announcement. It begins with a changed invitation, a delayed response, a chair removed from a meeting where it used to be waiting. For Camilla, the confirmation became real when the palace routine shifted around her. Nothing dramatic was said. That was the cruelty of it. The doors simply began closing one by one. Camilla noticed the first change in the smallest possible way. A briefing note that once arrived without question did not appear. A secretary came in with careful eyes and a voice too gentle to be natural, explaining that estate-related briefings would now follow revised protocol. Protocol meant the official order of who receives information, who attends meetings, and who has authority to respond. That detail mattered because it turned private pain into daily reality. The Queen Consort was no longer automatically included in discussions connected to the property, not because anyone openly pushed her out, but because Charlotte's future claim had quietly changed the rules around her. Camilla listened without interrupting. Then she sat alone, her hand resting on an unopened envelope, feeling the silence grow until it seemed louder than any accusation. Charles tried to comfort her, but comfort sounded fragile now. He told her the adjustment was procedural, that no one intended cruelty, that the palace was simply protecting the promise, as the trustees had instructed. Yet the king heard the weakness in his own words. Camilla heard it too. Both of them knew he had been present when the chance to challenge the decision passed across the table. Both of them knew he had set the pen down. That was why his reassurance could not reach her. The estate had once represented belonging. Now it had become a reminder that even beside the monarch, the Queen Consort could still find herself outside a locked circle. Catherine learned of the next change with a different kind of fear. Charlotte's name now appeared in planning summaries, tied to future guardianship and residence protections. A private residence file had been moved into a protected category, meaning only selected people could view, discuss, or influence its contents. That mattered, because it proved the trustees had not simply made a symbolic statement. They had built a barrier around Charlotte's future, and barriers invite attention. Catherine felt no triumph. She felt a mother's dread. Her daughter had been shielded in law, but exposed in emotion. The young princess was becoming a symbol before she could understand what the symbol meant. William saw the danger before the palace fully admitted it. The promise had succeeded in one way and failed in another. It had protected Charlotte from interference, but it had also placed her name at the center of a wound spreading through the family. The prince knew that if he left the matter to papers, schedules, and closed briefings, Camilla's humiliation would harden into resentment, and Charlotte would be blamed for a decision she never made. He could not allow that, not as a father, not as the future king. So before the palace could turn Charlotte into a symbol, William chose to speak to Camilla without lawyers, trustees, or witnesses between them. The turning point came in a room without advisors. No trustees sat at the table. No documents were opened. No one took notes. William asked Camilla for a private conversation because he understood that legal victory could still leave a family wounded beyond repair. She arrived guarded, wounded, and angry. He arrived with the one thing she had not expected: restraint. William did not begin with defense. He did not speak like a prince protecting a ruling or a future king defending the machinery of the crown. He spoke like a father trying to keep his daughter's name from becoming a weapon. That was why he had requested the meeting himself. The estate confirmation had already settled the legal matter, but the emotional damage was still spreading, and he knew it. Camilla sat across from him with her pride held tightly around her, still wounded by the feeling that the palace had moved around her in secret. The Queen Consort did not want another explanation from Trustees. She did not want polished language about provisions or protected files. She wanted to know whether anyone in that family understood what had been taken from her. Camilla finally said what the room had been avoiding. The estate had felt like proof, she admitted. Proof that she had crossed the final bridge from tolerated presence to accepted figure. Losing it did not feel like losing a house. It felt like being erased all over again, returned to the old shadows, reminded that some doors in the monarchy could open beside her and still close against her. William listened without interruption, and that silence surprised her. She had expected resistance. She had expected cold victory. Instead, the prince let her pain stand in the room without trying to crush it beneath Charlotte's name. William answered quietly, and every word carried a warning wrapped in mercy. Charlotte did not take anything from Camilla. The promise was made to protect a child from the storms adults create. That mattered because it changed the shape of the wound. The estate was no longer only a symbol of Camilla's exclusion, it was also a shield, built around someone too young to defend herself. The Queen Consort heard the difference. She still hurt. She still felt the sting of secrecy. But for the first time, she saw that William was not celebrating her loss. He was trying to stop that loss from turning into hatred, aimed at his daughter. William then made the promise Camilla had not expected. Charlotte would not be paraded as a victor. The estate would not be used to shame the Queen Consort. Not in briefings, not in private conversations, not in palace whispers dressed up as destiny. The prince understood. Triumph could be as cruel as defeat when a family was already bleeding. Camilla rose from the conversation still wounded, but something in her anger had shifted. She no longer saw Charlotte as the enemy. And that changed everything the palace would do next. But outside palace walls, restraint was impossible, because the world had already found its headline. By morning, the private promise had become a public storm. The monarchy's quietest decision was suddenly shouted from front pages, studio desks, and crowds gathered outside royal gates. Camilla's devastation was no longer hidden behind polished walls. Charlotte's name was no longer protected by silence. The estate had become a symbol, and Britain began arguing over what that symbol meant. Camilla watched the morning broadcast without speaking. The words came smoothly from the presenters, but each sentence seemed to land with a private sting. They described her as the woman left outside the inheritance she thought would define her security, and the phrase cut deeper because it turned her private wound into public language. The Queen Consort had survived years of judgment, but this was different. This was not only criticism, this was exposure. The estate promise had broken beyond trustees' minutes, meaning the official notes of a private decision, and beyond family conversations that had once been protected by palace walls. Now everyone had an opinion, and every opinion seemed to place Camilla on one side and Charlotte on the other. Catherine heard Charlotte's name on television and reacted before thought could soften instinct. She turned off the broadcast before her daughter entered the room, because she understood what the public argument was doing. Commentators were framing the promise as a generational shift, a sign that the monarchy was placing its emotional future in younger hands. That mattered, because Charlotte was no longer only a child inside a family. She had become a symbol of continuity, meaning the steady passing of royal identity from one generation to the next. Catherine felt the danger in that word. Continuity sounded noble from a studio desk, but inside a home, it meant pressure, scrutiny, and a childhood touched by battles she had never chosen. William saw the same storm from another angle. The prince had promised Camilla that Charlotte would not be used to humiliate her, yet the world had already begun doing exactly that. A major newspaper captured the mood with brutal simplicity. The estate gates beneath the headline, "Promise to Charlotte." That single front page changed the story. People near Buckingham Palace gathered in clusters, some praising the decision as protection for the future, others calling it a public humiliation for Camilla. The crowd was not large enough to threaten the monarchy, but it was loud enough to prove the wound had escaped the family. Charles understood that silence would now look like weakness. The king had tried to keep the matter contained, but containment had failed. Camilla's pain had become a national argument. Charlotte's promise had become a headline. William's restraint had been overtaken by public hunger for drama. So the palace prepared a final internal statement. Not to reverse the trustees, not to reopen the estate provision, and not to pretend the damage had not happened. The words were chosen carefully, because they had to do what no private meeting had managed to do: protect Charlotte without crushing Camilla completely. And when the final words were settled, the monarchy chose not to hide the truth anymore. It chose to live with it. In the end, the estate was more than land. It was a verdict on memory, loyalty, protection, and the future of the crown. Camilla lost a symbol she believed would secure her place. Charlotte inherited a promise she never asked for. Charles faced the cost of standing between them, and William learned that protecting the future sometimes means allowing the present to break. Camilla felt the fight leave her slowly, not because the wound had healed, but because the answer had become impossible to change. The trustees' confirmation remained final, and the royal estate was reserved for Charlotte under the protected promise that had survived every question, every pause, and every private ache inside the family. A trustee is a person appointed to guard a legal promise or property arrangement, and in this case, their final word mattered, because it placed the estate beyond personal pressure. The Queen Consort had wanted reversal. She had wanted recognition. Instead, she had to face the painful truth that the property she saw as proof of belonging had become proof of something else. The monarchy's future would not always move in the direction of her needs. Charles carried that truth in private. The king knew he had not abandoned Camilla without feeling the cost, but he also knew he could not give her everything she wanted without damaging the promise made around Charlotte. That was why the decision mattered beyond one estate. It marked a generational transition, a passing of emotional weight from the adults who had fought for position to the younger royals expected to inherit duty. Continuity, in plain terms, means keeping the monarchy steady from one generation to the next, and Charles understood that this continuity demanded sacrifice. The monarch had chosen not comfort, but survival. He had chosen the line ahead of the wound beside him. William and Catherine chose silence with purpose. They did not celebrate. They did not allow Charlotte to be presented as a winner, because the prince and his wife understood that triumph would only deepen the family injury. The young princess had not defeated Camilla. She had been protected from storms she was too young to understand. Catherine carried that fear like a mother, while William carried it like a future king. Together, they made sure the estate promise stayed what it was meant to be, not an insult against the Queen Consort, but a shield around Charlotte and the future line of the crown. Camilla finally stopped asking for the decision to be undone. Her devastation settled into quiet acceptance. Not peaceful, not painless, but real. Charles was humbled by what he could not change. William was hardened by what he had to protect. Catherine was sobered by what her daughter's name now carried. And Charlotte, innocent at the center of it all, became the symbol of a monarchy choosing legacy over comfort, continuity over appeasement, and a child's future over an adult's desire for symbolic victory. And that was the final emotional truth. Camilla was devastated. Charlotte was protected. Charles was humbled. And the monarchy moved forward, carrying the scar of a promise that could no longer be hidden. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.